Hello, I'm Ginger Dunham of Greenhouse Preschool in Bothell, and today I'm going to be reading Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Spring Classic. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any farther. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. The next morning, as they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, they did not find very much to eat. But just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It seemed to be pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. But the big bird was too proud to answer. "It's a statue." But the people on the boat threw a bunch of peanuts in the water, so the Mallard family followed them all the way around the pond and got another breakfast, much better than the first. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right here in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that Mrs. Mallard had at last found a place that suited her. But then, "Weebk! Oh, look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard all of a dither. "You'll get run over!" And when she got her breath again, she added, "This is no place for babies, with all those horrible things rushing about. We will have to look again, somewhere else." So off they flew, over Beacon Hill and around the State House, but there was no place there. And then they looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in there. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard hopefully. "That island looks like a very nice place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks like a very good place to raise and hatch ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. Once a year, all their old wing feathers fall out, and they can't fly until the new ones grow in. But of course, they could still swim and walk. So one day, they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman named Michael. Michael liked them and fed them peanuts. And after that, the Mallards visited Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she could not go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs and keep them warm. It was a lot of work. She only moved off the nest for quick drinks of water and quick snacks, or to count the eggs and make sure they were all still there. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, and Lack, and then Mac, and then Knack, and then Oack, and then Pack, and then Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great big responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and of course it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like farther on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week," he said. "I will meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of our ducklings." "Oh, don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them how to walk in a safe, straight line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance away from bikes and scooters and cars and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with their behavior, she said one morning, "Come along, children, you're ready. Follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mac, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack all fell into line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore, and they waddled along until they came to the edge of the highway. Mrs. Mallard started to step out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack, said Mrs. Mallard, and she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. And the cars kept speeding by, honk, honk, honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, 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 quacking. And they all made so much noise that Mr. Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the cars, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to the police booth. He knew they'd need more help later. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." And Clancy said, "A family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop, and she turned onto Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Ah, isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the seats said, "Oh, well now, isn't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them complimenting her ducklings and herself, she was so proud she tipped her nose up in the air and walked with an extra swing in her waddle. And when they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car, with the 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so that Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march safely in line across the street. And right into the public garden, where their father was waiting. Inside the gate, they all turned around to quack, "Thank you," quack, 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 to the policemen. The policemen all smiled and waved goodbye. And when they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he'd promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there, now that they were all grown up. All day long they would follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And when nighttime falls, they all swim together back to their little island in the middle of the park and go to sleep. The end. Thank you so much for listening.